Well, this is awesome. Thank you all so much for being out here tonight. You are in for a treat, I am sure of it. The reason we're here tonight is because of a wonderful partnership we have with the Oregon Black Pioneers, and because of an exhibit that they have created that's on display at the Oregon Historical Society right now. Another question, how many have been to see A Community on the Move? Awesome. It's good, right? I mean, it is really good. It really is. This is, honestly, it's an incredible exhibit, and the Oregon Black Pioneers work with a mission to research, recognize, and commemorate the culture and heritage of African Americans in the state of Oregon. The goal of the Oregon Black Pioneers is to secure a place and a forum in which this heritage can be shared with the greater public, and I'd say we are achieving that goal here tonight. So, founded in 1993, Oregon Black Pioneers has published 2 books, both of which are available for sale tonight. One showcases history of African Americans in Portland, and the other is African Americans in Polk and Marion counties, I think. Is that right, Willie? Yes. All right. And some of that history is going to be very surprising to folks who think they might know everything about Oregon's past. We at the Oregon Historical Society are very proud of this partnership with the Oregon Black Pioneers. We greatly admire the community-driven initiatives of their work, and they've resulted in that exhibit that you can come and see at OHS, see it once, see it twice, see it a bunch of times. It's worth it. And of the kind of public programs that you're going to see tonight, there's a flyer on the back table. You can sign up, give your information to Oregon Black Pioneers in the guest book, but also pick up this little flyer because on Saturday, May 16th, the Oregon Black Pioneers are going to visit African American heritage sites in the Willamette Valley. This sounds like an amazing tour, and I think it's going to be awesome. Tickets are very low priced, and so if you are free on May 16th, or you can change plans that you might already have, I would urge you to definitely check this out. I want to thank personally the leadership of the Oregon Black Pioneers, especially Gwen Carr and Willie Richardson and Kim Moreland for being such incredible partners, and also the organizer of tonight's program, the totally awesome Donna Maxey, who also organizes Race Talks. All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, who will then welcome up our speakers, and we will get started. Tonight's program will be moderated by an Oregon Black Pioneers stalwart, Michael Chappie Grice. He is a teacher, administrator, coach, mentor, researcher, college instructor, entrepreneur, arts advocate, raconteur, grandfather, and documentary filmmaker. He has worked more than 40 years in public education. He holds a BA from Cornell College in Iowa and an MAT from Reed College here in Oregon. Mr. Grice was recognized nationally in 2010 with the H. Council Trenholm Human and Civil Rights Award from the National Education Association. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Chappie Grice.
Thank you, Eliza. Good evening.
Good evening.
Glad that you're here. You're in for a very special treat today, and it's historic in that it's not every day. The fact that you are in this room, you will remember for a very long time. I go back to our friend Abraham Lincoln, who said, "You may not long remember what we say here, but you will forever remember what we did here." And that's the expression that I'm leaning on tonight, that you will have a great experience, something that's memorable, something that your friends and family and associates wish they had experienced. So be an ambassador for the Oregon Black Pioneers and for the Oregon Historical Society, a terrific partnership. And if you have an organization, think about ways in which you might partner with authentic ethnic communities, particularly those that are telling the untold story. Did anyone see today's Oregonian? The front page story about Vanport. Trust me, there's more to that story than what was in today's Oregonian. But that window was opened, and I hope that you will explore it and open it wider and find out even from the Oregon Historical Society, or perhaps especially from the Oregon Historical Society and Portland State University and their ethnic studies centers. I'd like to again thank Willie Richardson and Gwen Carr and Kim Moreland for the work that they did in helping us mount all aboard the story of railroading and Portland's Black history last year at the Oregon Historical Society. Thank you very much. And it goes without saying the courageous and innovative work of Donna Maxey and the Race Talks event. Portland, Oregon is way ahead of the curve in terms of other cities who need and want to have that particular dialogue. But today we're here to talk about the jazz clubs, the jazz era, the music, the nightclubs, the nightlife that so defined the community that is called the black community, but it was everybody's community because everybody attended. I hope that you will take notes. I hope that there are some memories that you will try to capture, either on paper or your cameras are welcome to visit the remarks by the gentlemen. And all of these men are backed by family and women, so let's give our hands together for the women that make a lot of this possible. I see these, the cords are hooked up now. They were dangling a few minutes ago, so now our videographer has got all that he needs. I'd like to welcome to the chairs here. We're going to use these. I don't know, we moved one over here. You might find either you need to move it back. Somebody will help me with that. From Spokane, Washington. Yeah, it sounds like an introduction to our famous trailblazer. But he is a trailblazer, and for 19 years, he managed and delivered for you the Cotton Club, Paul's, and Geneva's Lounge. Mr. Paul Knowles, the mayor of another gentleman that we had an opportunity to work with in designing the exhibit. He is a professional exhibit designer, and he designs exhibits on the scale of what you will find at the Oregon Historical Society. His grandfather came to Portland in 1897, so that tells you that his history, his father, like mine, as well as he, was born here in Portland, a rare commodity of African American, a rare status for African American men, and that's none other than Bill Rutherford. Bill, would you give him a seat? Born in Meridian, Mississippi. Executive, retired from Atlantic Richfield. A man who knows all about the music from the inside to the outside, Mr. Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson, will you take a seat up there, please? Last and certainly not least, a friend of mine, a friend of my family's, who's been with us for many, many decades, and who knows also about the ins and outs, the ups and the downs of the jazz era in Portland, music in general, and the personalities that have defined Black Portland, known as Jim T, Mr. Jim Thompson. Please take the stage, Jim. In an effort to be transparent and to easily help you follow what's going on, I want to read to you now the questions that I'll be asking. This is a complete set of questions, so you can marinate and they can be thinking about what comments they might want to say early on. I'm the only one with notes. See, a couple people. Their knowledge is deep and pure and rich, even without notes, and you'll find that if you ever get into a conversation, they don't bring notes, they just start telling it to you. From where and when did your family migrate to Portland, and why did they come? What were some outstanding memories about where and why your family moved to Portland? What are your memories and your thoughts about life in Portland as a child? How did you get introduced to nightlife in Portland's Black community? Why was the nightlife so important in Portland's Black community? What and where were some of the clubs located? What was the community's interface with the white community and the police? Who were some of the local and national entertainers who performed in Portland, and they were numerous, as you will hear? Did your parents belong to any social groups, and what were they? Why have you decided to stay in the Portland area? And of course, any other comments that come to their minds are going to be legitimate and just as rich as these formalized questions. I give to you now our panel of men, backed by the great women and their families, and give to you this panel on nightlife in Portland. I'm going to go right down the line, starting with Jim T. and come this way. Do I need this microphone? Or? Okay. All right. You should know this. In the African tradition, and I might have mentioned this at the outset, in the African tradition, we cannot speak, us youngins, without the permission of the elders. So we always ask as a formality and as a way of instructing the larger community about the African tradition of getting permission. So let me ask my elders here, may I proceed? All right, good. We're going to kick it off with Ben Johnson, as he's going to talk about his thoughts on the questions that we've enumerated for you. Ben Johnson.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Everybody? How about that?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Couple of disclosures. Number one, for all of us, we all are the sum total of our experiences. That's who we are. And I'm going to share with you some of my experiences. And I'm one of the oldest guys in the room, Jim T. and I came to Oregon in 1943. I was 13 years old, 12 years old. Do the math, I'm 84 years old. I'm blessed to be here. But I thought what would be helpful is to give you some sense of reference of what we talk about, why we talk about it, how Portland was and what it was like in 1943 when I came. And talk about nightclub and nightlife, I could only relate to you what my parents told me. Obviously, I was too young to hang out in the joints at that time. Didn't take long, though, before Jim T. and I got there. Much of what I will say, I'm sure Jim T. will say, because he's the brother I never had. We were always together. We were the same age, and we had similar experiences. But in 1943, well, we started in 1940, really. The black population in Portland was about 900, about 1,800 in the whole state. In other words, less than 1%. It was about the same amount for Asians, Native Americans, Hispanics. There was no count. There was just almost no Hispanics in Oregon in 1940. Of course, at the beginning of the war, when people started being recruited in the South and migrated to the North, Portland being a war producer of ships, there were 4 or 5 shipyards here. My father was recruited. We came to Portland in 1943. He was a welder. And it was a big opportunity for us, and many of us who came here. Prior to us being here, my mother was a school teacher, never made more than $16 a month in her life. My father made about, well, when we got here, he had just gotten a job making $18 a week. That made us rich. Folks didn't have that kind of money. But I'm getting to the point where I'm trying to bring to you what happened when many black Americans came to Portland to work in the shipyards and the other war industries. For the first time in our lives, we had money. They had discretionary income to spend and wanted to spend it. The problem was how can and where you spend it. We could go to Jansen Beach. We could do the amusement park. We couldn't go to the dance hall nor swim in the pool. We could go to the theater, to the movies really, and we could go to church. There were 4 prominent black churches at the time, church. Mount Olivet was a Baptist church. St. Philip's was an Episcopal church. And Immaculata was a Catholic church. Those are the principal churches that blacks went to. Of course, they went to others. Although most blacks lived in the Albany area and Vanport, remarkably, there were a few lived in various parts of the city, but there were so few, most people knew one another. And you knew what families live outside of Albany. You just knew them by name. You could call them. But anyway, when all these folks came to Vanport, initially, there were about 9,000, and then it went to 20,000 during the height of the war. Now that's quite an impact. It's a lot of folks have a consuming ability, but again, the difficulty of consuming. That was a war on at that time, World War II. That's why we were here. It's a much different war than the war we have today, because back in those days, they had a national draft, but we all were involved eminently, either through relatives, people we knew, or friends. And we all were extremely patriotic, wanted to do what we could for the war effort. But because of the war, everything was directed toward the war. We had a ration program. In other words, foods was rationed. You couldn't buy certain meats. You couldn't buy butter. You couldn't buy sugar. You could buy some shoes. You couldn't buy gasoline. It was rationed. You could buy a certain amount, a limited amount. But there weren't a lot of people that had cars back in those days, because in those days, the standard of living for everybody was such that a car was a luxury. It wasn't something that was a necessity. But in 1941, they stopped building American cars, automobiles. Everything was built for the draft, for the Army. So you couldn't buy a car, and we had money to buy a car, couldn't buy it. Clothing was rare and not very stylish. Women had to give up silk hose and underwear because silk went to making the parachutes in the Army. So that's just a sense of what was available. Very limited stuff was available, so we had a lot of pent-up money to spend. So a lot of that money was spent entertainment that we could achieve, and that was the nightclubs. That was Williams Avenue. We were channeled there because in those days, you couldn't go to white venues, but they could come to ours. You couldn't go to restaurants. You couldn't go to hotels, motels. They were off limits, which caused some difficulty for people that were, particularly musicians coming to Portland. They didn't have any place to stay. There were a couple of black hotels that were clean, but they weren't what you call 4-star. So people lived with families. I remember we had a group live with us and some people down the street. And there were some remarkable friendships developed with musicians who came through Portland at that time. But what happened after a while, it got to the point where there was so much going on in the Williams Avenue area. There were 3 principal clubs. One was the Fraternal Hall, was a nightclub. Across the street, like everything was in 4 blocks, across the street, at that time was a club called the Acme Club. Later became the Savoy, later became the McMenamins. About a block and a half up the street, there was a Dude Ranch, a very upscale, really incredible club. It challenged, clubs you see in the movies, clubs in the East. It was so well appointed. And the theme being Dude Ranch. They had a camera person, they had a cigarette girl, they had the waitresses wore short skirts, boots, had a gun, cowboy hat, the whole thing. I'm told this by my parents. Obviously, they couldn't go there at that time. It was a place you'd like to go as a kid, but you couldn't. But many of the artists that later became famous in America came through Portland, because one thing about the Dude Ranch and the money that was being spent at that time, they could afford to have reviews and top level musicians who many of them at that time had not made the big time. People like Miles Davis. I'm trying to think of people. Charlie Parker came to Portland also. Errol Gardner. Sammy Davis Jr. came to Portland, but he didn't come to the black area. He only appeared over town in the Embassy Club and those kind of places. So they were kind of down on Santa. And, but there were a number of musicians that came through when they weren't famous, like Coltrane. A number of who later became very oh gosh, I can remember anything but names. Jim T.
Can you remember Jim T? No.
Can't help it, remember Jim T.
Toss it over to Jim T for just a minute. Jim T, I know
No,
that.
but he'll get to this because at the clubs at that time, there were a lot of reviews, dancers, comedians, other than the musicians who came to those clubs. And there was enough revenue to attract that kind of artists back in those days. Now the white musicians, there were a number of white bands in Portland, good bands, but they played dance music. In other words, they didn't play jazz until they were off from work and then come over on the black side and sit in with the black musicians. And that's just kind of the way it was. We couldn't go there, but they could come to our place. And the major artists were, at that time, we had a ballroom over town that we could go. There were a number of ballrooms in Portland. That's how the whites had their major bands come to Jansen Beach, those ballrooms. But we could use McElroy's on occasions. We had a very industrial guy named Stan Dukes who was a promoter. And on off days, you could get big bands to come to Portland. And McElroy was one of the places that would house them. It was kind of an interesting environment in that you had a lot of people there. And you had 3 enforcement officers. One was a matron, whom we all knew, Mrs. Hepburn, and they had probably 2 county auxiliary officers. It was just that kind of respect that in those days, you couldn't have those kind of people, that many people today without having all kinds of law enforcement. But 2 things happened. Number one, in those days, you kind of respected older people, particularly women, and we knew we were enjoying ourselves and we didn't want to screw it up. So our behavior was very good. But we did get to see a lot of top artists that come through Portland. And some guys have been coming through Portland for years, like Duke Ellington. Of course, he had his own rail car. But Portland usually was not a destination spot for most of these big bands because they were either going to Seattle or they were coming from California. But in those days, you traveled by train or bus. Airlines was not in the travel possibilities in those days because of schedules and because of cost. So we got a lot of folks who were going somewhere that came to Portland, stayed in Portland, and entertained while they were here. But in this kind of a triangle where everything was the corner of Cherry Court, Williams Avenue, what's the other street there? Wilder, and, well anyway, everything came together. There was this nexus of this entertainment circle. And there was one other place I got to talk to you about. It's called Slaughter's Pool Hall. And he said, well, why do you want to talk about Slaughter? I'll get to that. But Slaughter's was unique in that he had a jukebox. And he played his own music, his own records. And what was unique about that was, back in those days, the mob controlled the distribution of music. They put the records on the jukeboxes, and they had the jukeboxes. And for the black entertainment, they had jazz, rhythm and blues. But Slaughter had his own records. He put his own records on there, which later became a big draw. But one of the reasons he was able to do that, because there were 3 alleged vice lords back in those days. One was, they all came along together bootleggers. One was alleged. I say alleged because you all folks are going to document all this stuff, so I got to be legally correct. Alleged to have been Lonnie Loxton, who had Clackamas County, that was gambling, and the illicit businesses there. Tom Johnson controlled the Williams Avenue area. was a guy named Bill Elkins who had Multnomah County. He had the gambling, the prostitution, and arguably, well, rather rumored anyway, he was also involved in the abortion bills, which they had back in those days. But nothing happened in the Williams Avenue area that Tom Johnson wasn't a part of. He was a unique guy. You might say he was a benevolent vice lord, if there's such a thing, because he helped a lot of folks get involved in those businesses. Because in those days, blacks couldn't go to the bank, they couldn't get loans, which Jim can tell you, most of those houses that were sold in Albina were sold on contract, because that's the only way you could buy a house back in those days. But anyway, many of these businesses were funded by Tom, and he owned almost all that property in that area. Not just that area, but there was a section between First and Martin Luther King, all the way down to the Holiday Hospital from like Rutherford, that was vacant with the exception of the Catholic school there. I don't remember what school was. Do you remember that school? But anyway, that was the only thing. But Tom owned that property. He owned property over town. He owned property in the East, Oregon, the Western Oregon. He became a very, a wealthy man. And because most blacks were confined to Albina because there were covenants in other parts of the city, you couldn't move. But he had a partner who looked very white, and blacks knew he wasn't white, but most white people didn't know he was white. So he bought a lot of property for Tom, and he happened to have had a white girlfriend who was a lawyer, but he was able to get Tom to diversify and buy all this property. He became a very wealthy man. But again, I don't know if any of you saw the movie about Bunkie Johnson in Harlem, he was the numbers czar, fighting the mafia for control. But Tom, they didn't have those kind of struggles here, but he was similar in that Bunkie was also a very benevolent guy. He helped a lot of people out, kids in college, scholarship and all that kind of stuff. Tom did the same thing. So he's a very vital part, a very essential part of that part of town. Now,
Ben Johnson. Give it up for Ben Johnson. Getting us off to a good start.
I want to do one more piece.
You got one more piece.
Yeah, the Dude Ranch. It was so successful. Remarkably, before that, it was Portland had a famous jazz band called the Castle Jazz Band. It was Dixieland, and they were housed at the Dude Ranch, but because of the demographic switch, they were moved out, and allegedly sold to two black entrepreneurs who the rumor was that maybe they were fronting for that. But anyway, after about a year, it was such enjoyable and fantastic success, they closed it. And they closed it allegedly because there was too much behavior in the street and so forth. But what the real reason they believed was there was too much race mixing. That was the code for white women with black guys. So they closed it. You can take it on from there.
All righty then. Ben Johnson, and a beautiful foundation. I would go to Jim T. He's thinking right now, his wheels are turning and he's warm up here, but I'm going to come all the way over here to Paul Knowles, who has a fresh memory of the nightclub business. And I would like to ask him to talk about nightclub life and the patrons that came and how they enjoyed life in the nightclub.
If there's any time at the end, I'd like to talk about Slaughter's Pool Hall.
All right. Well, by the way, Slaughter's Pool Hall is highlighted in a book called Jumptown. I don't know if you've had a chance to get your hands on it. It's almost out of print. It's not available in any of the stores, and I probably put myself further back in the queue by announcing it tonight. But I'd like for you to get your hands on it. I hope that you get a chance to discover it, because that's where you'll find more about the Slaughter's Pool Hall. Paul Knowles, welcome.
Well, from a little town in Huntington, Arkansas. Fort Smith is 30 miles north and right on the Oklahoma border. I joined the United States Air Force in 1949, was shipped to San Antonio, Texas, And in 48, that's when the president said the armies will no longer be segregated. So one day I got a call and they asked me to come in and talk to the colonel. And they were going to send an African American, Negro, black, to Spokane, Washington to integrate the base. So when he told me in Spokane, Washington, man, I was happy because everywhere you went, everyone was from LA, Chicago, New York, or Washington, D.C. So when I heard Washington, I thought I was going to Washington, D.C. The guy told me, said, no, that's way up there by Seattle. So I looked at a map and there it was. So I got shipped up there. I was the first African American on the base there. So jump forward about 12 years after working 2 jobs for 12 years. Go to work at 8, get off at 5, go to work at 6, and get off at 11. I saved enough money to come to Portland and get into the nightclub business. That was in 1963. The nightclub was really a unique place. It was a place to be seen, a place to have fun. All the big artists that played downtown, after they left their venue downtown, they would come to the Cotton Club and sit in with my band. Any night you could see Sammy Davis Jr., Joe Louis came through when he came to town. We had all types of big time people. They would just want to come to the Cotton Club because it was the spot to be seen. And if you were if you came from Portland to Texas, from Texas to Portland, and you went back home, people would actually say, well, you were in Portland, Oregon? Yeah. Did you go to the Cotton Club? No, I didn't. Well, you haven't been to Portland then, unless you've been to the Cotton Club. But we had some wonderful people that leave Portland and really become famous. Mel Brown is here in the city now. After a stint with Diana Ross, Martha and the Vandellas, the Four Tops, he was with those people for about 12 years. Finally got tired of the road and he came back. Ronnie Steen, he was 17 years old the night that he came to work for me. We were having Etta James. You saw the movie Cadillac Records, so that's Etta James. She went on to be famous. Got angry because Beyonce sang her song at the president's inauguration. And so Ronnie Steen, I went over, I said, Ronnie, have you ever played a show? He says, no. I said, well, you got to play one tonight. We got Etta James and da-da-da-da-da. So that was Ronnie's start there. But we had all types of musicians that go national. Another group, they call themselves the Three Little Souls. They came to me, and there was 5 of them in the group. I told them I can't pay 5 people, but if you cut it down to 3, then they came to work, and they worked there for about a year, just on weekends, because they were 13, 15, and 16 years old, so they could do the shows. Actually, what happened to them was Sammy Davis Jr. somehow found out about them, and they left the club, went to the 3-Star for a while, and they went to Hollywood. They wound up having a fantastic career. They were on the Sammy Davis Jr. show. Bob Hope took them to Vietnam with him when he used to travel over there to have his shows for the troops. They were just beautiful. One of the stars, which her name was Ren Woods, she wound up as Dorothy in The Wiz. As a matter of fact, I talked to her the other day. I told her I was doing this show. I was going to mention her name. But it was just a spot. Doug Baker used to come over and see a show, and he would write about it. And of course, Doug, that was the Oregonian. Then there was another newspaper called the Journal. It was an afternoon paper. So all the whites would read about the show, and then all at once they walk in, and my 10 o'clock show, this place be full of white people, you know, where all these white people come from, you know. Well, Doug Baker wrote about the show last night, and then, boy, so we had the best of both worlds, because the whites would come early, and then the blacks are gonna come late. So the club is packed all night long. Boy, did we have a good time making some money. So that was part of the Cotton Club, and there's so many musicians that went through there. There's a group now called the Whispers. They sing a lot of love songs. The Whispers always say, there's been more babies born by people listening to our music, because they just do love songs, you know. And so we had a lot of entertainers come through, and a lot of them went national, and that's the story of the Cotton Club.
Story of the Cotton Club.
otherwise overlooked. Bill Rutherford.
That's one answer. I'd like to talk about that, but if you were to start at Fremont and go to Williams Avenue, when you got to Russell and turned right, you had Paul's Paradise there. If you turned left, you'd have the Texas Club, which was upstairs. And you'd have to go all the way to Broadway, as I can recall, before you would get in places like Jackie was around the corner, parallel to Cherry Street, I guess. You also had Keystone, I think was on the right. And you got down to Fraternal Hall, which became Benny Hamilton's Flamingo. That was about the length of where the clubs were that I know. Of course, the Cotton Club was around on Vancouver, but that was after I left. I would like to talk about the youth, at nightlife for the youth. I started playing piano at Knott Street Community Center when I was 14. And there was I could give you a whole list of named musicians, some of which ended up being professional musicians. The movie, the book, Jumptown, that's Homer Campbell playing guitar on the cover of that. The Campbells were a big family. One of the other boys, Travis, he sang. And the other was Grover, he was a ventriloquist. But he was so bad you could see his lips move on the radio. We played the, it was the park. Oh, all right. The Park Bureau ran the Knott Street Community Center, which had been the old Elliott School. And there's some musicians in there who worked as counselors. And Richard Moffat, he was a fine musician, choir director, pianist. But he would play in places like Jackie's. That's not a slight or anything, but it was not anything like the Cotton Club. And we had youth dance on Friday night. It was 9 cents to get in. And the occupancy was supposed to be 350, but sometimes there's 500 kids in there. And there was no windows open in the summertime, so it would make your eyes water. But that's a whole nother subject. What I would like to say is, and I don't know quite how to approach this, so I'll just say it. There was a blues tune. Back then you didn't have rock and roll. You had blues, or you had rhythm and blues, or you had jazz. And bebop was coming into town now. And big bands, or big black bands like Ellington you knew, but the Basie Band. There was Jimmy Lunsford, who died at the coast. It was suspected he was poisoned because he and the owner got into some things. But what I would like to say is that the kids would come up. I didn't know all these kids. I mean, there were a few people I knew, but the hundreds of kids that would show up on a weekend, a lot of them did have 9 cents. I mean, come on. And the blues tune was called Cornbread and Collard Greens. However, the tune itself was more of a rhythm than it was any, but the kids had a special name for this tune. And the name of the tune was Your Mama Don't Wear No Drawers. And finally they got to a point they would just ask for drawers. So piano players didn't have a lot to do. The kind of jump band we had, I ended up with a big wrist because I was playing all this ching, ching, ching stuff. But I couldn't go in the clubs because obviously I was too young, and somebody called my parents, and that started a whole other mess. There's not a lot I can really. I have a whole long list of names here. Most of you don't know, but there were very fine musicians who were from Portland or who landed here and stayed. A couple I will say, because these guys really knew more than I did, because I didn't stand on corners, because I went away to school and then I didn't have time to play. What?
Enter the names in the record by you.
Oh, all right. Okay. Don Anderson was a soloist. Sid Porter was a piano player. Walter Bridges had a big band. Richard Moffat, Henry LeBon, Henry LaBelle. Henry LeBon played for even silent films, the Orpheum, when he was young. he had mental problems, and he played it. Sometimes they have programs for him at Bethel. There, Sunday evening, there would be programs. Matter of fact, Marian Anderson sang at Bethel one night. McClendon, Bill McClendon he was also a professor at Reed. He was also part of the McCarthy thing when they came through here. But he had been a violinist, but they broke his thumbs in Texas. He played so well. So he became a piano player in Portland. He's quite an intellect. The Hamiltones was a singing group. They might have been musicians too, I don't know. That was in the 50s. Okay, right. Was he a violin player too?
No, drama.
Hubert Lewis. There was a musician called Long Goody. He was a bass player, and nobody knew his name till he died. Basie Day, Warren Bracken, Louis Richardson, okay, George Lawson, Billy Larkins, Mo Brown, who you know, Bobby Bradford, and Cleve Williams. They died recently. Charles Moore was our drummer. Henry Williams was a saxophone player, and his brother was supposed to be our manager. I never did figure that out. Fred Hannibal, Lionel Copeland, Julius Strong, who's a bass player, Homer I mentioned, Lloyd Allen is still playing music, blues. Joe Stafford, now he was a vocalist. They were that they were trying to promote. Well, Miller, the director,
Yeah.
and I don't know anything where the guy went. I mean, he was a singer. Okay. And McElroy's Spanish Ballroom is where the Portland building is now. Just to that one location I wanted to say. And of course you talked about Stan Duke, who was a promoter, and Clarence, as a matter of fact, Lionel Hampton was his godfather. So I think basically that's all I have to offer, because I really don't know the nightlife that most adults knew. Thanks.
Close to your mouth, and before it gets back to me, and see if you can fill in what you recall directly in terms of what made the music experience and the nightlife so memorable and or so outstanding to you and in your experience.
Well, can you hear me? Okay, how's this?
Better.
Okay, just like a lot of other people, my family came to Oregon because of the shipyards, and we were in the Vanport flood. After the flood was over, we settled in Portland. But I've always been interested in music, and so consequently, I used to call myself Dizzy. I wore black beret, horn-rimmed glasses,
I'd like to interrupt you at this point, because Dizzy Gillespie was our idol, and Jim Thompson, I was jealous of him because he could grow facial hair and I couldn't. So he had a goatee, he wore horn-rimmed glasses and a beret.
Well, that was one of the good things about being able to grow a goatee and wear a. See, I was able to get in some of those clubs that these other guys couldn't get in. Dick Bowman used to ask me, he said, "Jim, can't you get me into jackets?" I said, "Man, I can't get you into jackets." But I didn't have any problem because I dressed, I didn't dress like some of the teenagers. And like I said, I bought a big glasses, a beret, and the goatee. But I had no problem when I was 17, 18. I was in McClendon's. I was in all of the clubs. I mean, you name it, And so I enjoyed a lot of music. Now, we were talking earlier, you were talking about Slaughters with his record, his jukebox. Slaughter used to let Ronstein, George Lawson, Mel Brown, they were all in there, say 14, 15 years old. He would let them come in about twice a week and just stand by the jukebox. They couldn't move around in the pool hall, but just stand by the jukebox and listen to jazz music. He did this they'd come in for about, maybe 2 days a week, and he'd let them come in, and he'd let them stay about half an hour, and he said, okay, you guys gotta go now, and shoo them out. But there was a lot of jazz music in the Portland area, all up and down Williams Avenue. There was, he was saying there was Paul's Paradise, and also Geneva's lounge and bar up in it. And one other thing you might notice, I might tell you about Geneva's barn up on Williams and Skidmore. When Portland Trailblazers won the championship, Paul had the city to block off the street, a block each way. And that's where they celebrated right after the game was over. That's where they celebrated right there in Geneva's. Everybody was just, as far as you could see, was people there at Geneva's. And everybody had a good time. So that was one of the highlights of Geneva's. But as I said, I've always enjoyed music. I went to the Monterey Jazz Festival for over 40-something years. And I still like to listen to the music whenever possible. And, it's too bad that we don't have the music scenes and the nightclubs in that area that we had in those days, because it's just gone. I mean, there are some other clubs and things you can go to, but the atmosphere is not the same as it was in the Williams Avenue area.
Isn't it true that because people were confined to one area with the redlining, we talked about the inability to purchase homes, the inability to go to other restaurants and venues in the city, that people were confined then, and as a result of that, that intensity contributed to the scene, because you were finding it weekend after weekend, and these were all working class people.
Right. Yeah, these were people that, like I said, a lot of them didn't come out until Saturday night.
During the war, it was 24/7.
Yeah, oh yeah. But afterwards, it wasn't that way. But
I just said during the war, it was 24/7. People were on the street all the time because people worked 3 shifts. If they weren't home, they were at work or going out to be entertained.
Were there any innovations, any times you remember that changed, if you compare the early years of the nightclubs and then the later years in the late 70s? And by the way, I know that Paul Knowles is often referred to as the mayor of Albina, or the black mayor of Portland, or the mayor of Black Portland. And that occurred on the Tuesday following the Trailblazers winning the 1977 World Championship. So greet the mayor with another round of applause, and thank him for hosting a victory party that we're still celebrating.
I'll have to tell you how that came about. Roy J., he is head of the African American Chamber. He came in our salon one day. He said, you know what, I'm going to start calling you the mayor. I said, Roy, I just Paul. No, you're the mayor. That's the way you talk. You're the mayor. You're the mayor of Northeast Portland. And so then pretty soon the newspapers had it. And then later on the television people had it. Now you go on Google, so don't believe everything you read, because it says Paul Knowles, mayor, honorary mayor of Northeast Portland.
And if you haven't been to Geneva's salon, was it Sheer Perfection? Yes. You will see the Wall of Fame, and Paul Knowles has a photograph of him and his recent wife all across the Wall of Fame with every celebrity in America. And I think everybody has been here, from Muhammad Ali, and we're talking about not just entertainers, but athletes, and as well as artists of every stripe that have been there. So I hope you get to see that Wall of Fame at Geneva. Continue on, will you, Jim T?
No, as I said, all through the area, you're talking about one other thing I might mention. People, as far as buying houses, were kind of redlined. There were certain areas that they couldn't buy. Actually, a black person couldn't buy a house east of 7th Street. I remember once, at that time I was selling real estate, and a guy called our office and said he wanted to list his home for sale. This particular house was on Northeast 15th, just south of Fremont Street. So we went over and took a look at it, and the house was perfect. So he said, I'll give you a listing, but I don't want you to put a sign out. So we said, okay, fine. So at that particular time, there was a professional boxer named Eddie Machen had just moved to Portland, and he was looking for a house, and Herman said, that house is just the house for him. So the very next day, he took him over and looked at this house, and Eddie Machen said, I'll buy it. I'll pay cash for it. And he did. So after they got everything all final and everything, Herman asked me, he said, the owner, he said, can I put up a sign? He said, sure, go ahead now. So we put up a sign that day. The next day, between Fremont and the next Siskiyou, there must have been 10 houses up for sale. Yeah, it must have been at least 10 houses up for sale, you know. That's just the way it was. But eventually, you know, things got better, and now the whole area in there now, I mean, it's all, people are living all throughout that area. But that's the way it was back then. But back to the music, you know, we had several other clubs. There was one called the Delisa. It was on Northwest Gleason Street, just north of the Steel Bridge. It was owned by Fred Baker and Wilbur Newsom. And they always had a very good clientele. And they had one guy that used to come and play all the time, played saxophone, named Big J. McNeely. And boy, he'd blow his saxophone and he'd fall out in the floor and blow it. And he'd go out on the sidewalk and blow it, you know, blowing it. And the police had told him, say, hey, you can't do that, you know. But he still would do it. So one night, they pulled this, what they used to call them paddy wagons. They pulled his paddy wagon up outside, and Big J. McNeely come out blowing it. They opened the door and he walked right on in. They drove him on off. He was still playing. After they lost their lease on the Delisa, they opened up another. It was just a tavern on Union Avenue. It was just south of Russell Street, and it was named Fred's Place. That was another little music venue in that area. But like I said, there were a lot of good music venues in that area during that period of time.
Paul.
Speaking of venues with music, if you look in the newspaper every week, you'll see, I actually counted them once, there was 96 clubs that's featuring music in Portland on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday nights. And it's unique in Portland, and most people don't feature clubs like this, bands like this. Each band plays at a different location every night, and they just keep rotating and rotating. Like Mel Brown, Thursday nights, he's down at Jimmy Mac's. Then Saturday night, he will be someplace else. Sunday afternoon, he'll be someplace else. Ronnie Steen plays Wednesdays at Whiff's downtown near the train station. But on Sundays, he's over at Clyde's. And then on Tuesday, he's down at Produce Row. So he gets about 5 days running, getting the other blues musician, Norman Sylvester. He does 5 days a week, and they're all at different clubs. It really makes it unique because everybody gets, and they bring their own crowd. You know, now with social media, they just let everybody know where they're going to be. And everybody show up. This is interesting. There's a young man, not young, but his name is Mike Phillips. He has opened for Stevie Wonder for years. He's not big yet, but he makes a lot of money because he sells his records, his music on YouTube and iTunes or whatever, one of those tunes, you know. And then the other night I got a text and he said, yes, I do text you guys. have to have my glasses on so I can dance. But I got a text that he was going to have his birthday party down at the Portland Prime. That's in the Embassy Suite Hotel downtown. And he just texts his people to let them know where they're going to be. About 60 people showed up. He had his birthday party. He went over and played with Mel Brown a little bit. Then I was home about 11:30, but they were playing, you know. So that's Portland. The music is really live and well in Portland, just every weekend. And don't forget, on April the 11th, the Inner City Blues Festival is going to be. It's out on Lombard at the Eagle Hall. They raise money for health care. But we started that in 1988. We had raised money for Run, Jesse, Run when Reverend Jackson was running for president. That's when it started. It dropped off a few years, but the last 4 years I've been emceeing that show. So if you get a chance, come out and listen to some good blues. Sorry.
Eliza, are there any handheld microphones? Eliza Candy Jones, are there any handheld microphones? Because I'm sure there are some rich questions in the audience, but lingering, and that'll add to our discussion. I don't know if we have one, or maybe if you have a question and you want to simply stand, I'll repeat your question so the audience can hear it as well.
Could I give you one more
Ben
piece
Johnson.
of information?
Please.
No, when you talk about Clyde's, the irony of that, I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember, but Clyde's used to be the Coons Chicken Inn. And the facade was a big black face, big huge red lips, white teeth, with a little cap on. And you enter through the tooth in the door. Now what's ironic about that is now Clyde is owned by a black guy that plays jazz. Some things level themselves out.
I remember the railroad men talked about how there were so many signs in the windows in the restaurants that we cater to white trade.
Oh, yeah,
So when
absolutely.
we talk about Portland's history, the music is rich, and so is the history. And there's a lot of the story to be told. And so as we get these authentic voices, I'm welcoming questions from people that might clarify. I have one over here, and then you, sir. Did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did.
Oh.
My name is Rutherford. I had a question. On Williams Avenue, like from Pratt Hall all the way up to maybe Paul Paradise, didn't they call Williams Avenue the STEM?
Somebody want to comment about the STEM? You know the STEM.
Did
Thank
anybody
you.
ever hear about they used to call Williams Avenue the STEM? Well, they used to call it the STEM where brothers and sisters would eat. My mother worked at all the joints around town. She was one of the soul cooks, like Little Sandy. She met Louis Armstrong, brought them to the house for dinner. She was in the band.
It was a STEM.
Pardon me?
It was called a STEM. It was never called a STEM.
No, the STEM.
Yeah,
STEM.
yes, I understand. You're right. We call it STEM.
Yeah, but they had spaghetti and meatballs at the house, everything like that. But she cooked at Little Sandy's. Okay, you probably remember Miss Wiggles and Princess Zenobia, and she cooked at Little Sandy's, Paul Paradise, Red Front, Keystone. She cooked that all. You remember Mysterious Billy Smith?
You hit them all, dude.
Yeah, you
You
understand?
know them all.
You don't know it, Billy Smith. You had to have a razor with you. But anyway, all the places, Citizens. So. It was just really, I feel it was an exciting place at that time. All up and down the state was exciting.
It started changing when they built the Memorial Coliseum.
Yeah. Well, they built also on Williams and Hancock where
Yeah.
Collins Place Casino.
So a lot of those clubs moved north on Williams Avenue.
Remember Grandma Cookie Company moved down there.
Yep. All those things moved up.
Yeah, but it was exciting back then. Williams Avenue, we all lit up. Yeah, Williams Avenue would look like Las Vegas, a little strip, it was all lit up. It was exciting for little kids to look at. My brother used to take me to you Miss Hepburn. You remember Miss Hepburn?
Oh yeah, we know Miss Hepburn.
I seen Jay. Hey, I went down there and seen. I was a little kid. I don't know how I got in, but I was going around this place. My brother would take me. I don't know how I got in. I got in McElroy's ballroom and the Crystal Ballroom, Palace Royal. And so Miss Hepburn said, Richard, you had to keep your little brother out of here. But I seen James Brown when Please, Please, Please came out. That was when he was around about 30-some years old. Then I seen Little Richard came to McElroy Ballroom. Now he had a group called the Upsetters. And they were all nice little guys, and he had an orange section. And so Little Richard, everybody's waiting for Little Richard to come out. So Little Richard, I should say this, but this is the truth. Little Richard came out in a see-through negligee. And he had his hair out. But they put on a real good show. Real good show. They turned it out, you know what I'm saying? But that was back in the 50s and stuff like that. But yeah, it was really exciting. I was a little kid looking up at everybody and everything. And so, Miss Hepburn was really...
Do you remember Miss Hepburn's small bulky hammer?
No, I don't, but I want to go and jump on someone. Richard mentioned Dick Moffitt. Yeah, Richard Moffitt. Yeah, and you remember, well, he was my kind of voice coach when I was a little kid back there in them days. Ninth Street Community Center, the old LA. And Mildred Hughes, I think she was the director of the performing arts up there. Because in Ninth Street Community Center, you had the third floor was performing arts. The main floor in Ninth Street Community Center, which is Dishman's, yeah. The main floor you had ping pong and pool and all that. Now down at the bottom, a lot of people didn't know, it was the boxing team. And now Portland, Oregon, as a little city, they had when I say a bad boxing team, I mean a good boxing team. I mean, they would go back on the East Coast at the Nationals. Yeah. They took it for around about 2 or 3 years, and then all these boxers all over the country say, where is this little place called Portland? We had families of boxers. We had the Lincoln family. They had about 3 or 4 boxers in their family. We had the Brown family. You know, we had all kind of families that boxed. So we would go back to I think it was somewhere like what was it on the East Coast? I think it was in Massachusetts, somewhere back there.
What happened to allow that to happen?
Okay.
By the way,
His father.
Let me interrupt you to announce that Mr. Clifford McAfee. Thank you all, Cliff.
Clifford McAfee actually performed at the Cotton Club. That's one of my main things. Right over there, Clifford McAfee. Thank you, Clifford.
I want to tell how that was enabled, because after 1953, the Fair Housing Accommodation was passed, and it was under the direction, years' work of his father and his mother. They were there when they signed that bill. After that, artists could then stay in the hotels in Portland. So you got different people, different reviews, and who came through town and had a place to live, but it was because of his parents. And they ran pretty much out of their house. They were just selfless and hard workers. So,
as many of you know, here in McMenamins, the drinks are great, but people come here for the food. So I wanted to see if we could get some comments, and I won't forget your question. I want to get some comments about the kitchens and the great food that must have gone along with the nightlife in Portland. Anybody want to recall or point out any of the great cooks or the great kitchens that were accompanying the nightlife?
yeah, Mally's, Nance.
Everybody remember Commissioner Charles Jordan. We had a buffet set up at Geneva's, and Commissioner Jordan would show up with 2 or 3 people, and he would walk in, and he says, I just want one of those ham hocks, which they were about this large. I want some cornbread, and put some of that pot liquor out of the greens on top of the cornbread. Then he would always want the corner of the peach cobbler, and that would be his lunch. He would always come in that big old ham hock.
He went back to City Hall and went to sleep.
Any comment about the restaurant? You had a question. What's your question?
Oh yeah. Let's see. So my mom came up here as a wave officer to work in the shipyards during World War II. So I tell people that Henry J. Kaiser brought my mom and Sammy Davis Jr. to Portland. And people assume they got together, but I don't. As far as I know. So my question is, I heard that Sammy Davis Jr. and his Marston Trio performed here for about 2 years, and this was kind of a home to them that was real special to them, just after the more, and I'd like to ask you about that. If you ever saw them perform, if you ever saw them Marston.
No, they were the Matson Trio.
Okay.
But in those days, he appeared over town and we couldn't go over Amato's in the embassy room. Later, later in the 60s, when he came to his establishment, that was the first that he had ventured in the black establishment. We played golf with him it used to be Lloyd Center, Lloyd Golf Course. In fact, he still owes a friend of mine $5. A guy named Eddie Caldwell.
The night that Sammy came to the Cotton Club, my wife had gone to a concert that he had downtown, and she went to the after party, and Geneva was looking good. So everybody was wondering, who is that? Someone in Sammy's party came over and says, Sammy would like to talk to you, you know. Geneva said, okay. So she went over. She said, Sammy, my husband and I, she said it right up front, we own a nightclub, and we'd like to have you come by if you get a chance. He says, is it safe? She says, yes, it's very safe. So Geneva came back and said, honey, Sammy's coming over to the club here. I said, Geneva, Sammy is not coming to this club, you know. So after that, she wanted him back to watch the show. The door opened, and it was Sammy Davis Jr. And I says, good evening, Mr. Davis. He said, you got any greens here? I says, yes, we do. So I took him out in the restaurant. He ate. Then I went back. I says, honey, Sammy's here. She said, Sammy who? That was my wife. Yeah. Anyway, he stayed that night. He took pictures with everyone that would like to take a photograph. And that's when they had the Polaroid camera, you know, you had to rub it down. Also, he got up and he asked his director was with him, Rhodes, I think his name was. Anyway, he said, see if your band know anything that I know. So they knew a couple of tunes, so he got up and he sang. There was a dance called the Boogaloo. He did the Boogaloo. And people stayed and just took pictures after pictures after pictures. I have a photograph in the back of Sammy, my wife, and I were sitting on the stage in Geneva. And I always tell him in the Cotton Club, and I always tell everybody that when I show them the photograph, I say, you recognize that guy? That used to be me, because that was over 60 years ago, you know, when he was there. That's a Sammy story.
Question. You may use the mic, please. Yes, sir, we have a question coming from the floor. Are there any other questions? Please, I think your questions may in fact inform, we're recording this for television. You may have something that you want to contribute that will really amplify our presentations tonight. Go ahead, your question.
Hello, testing that. Well, I kind of came here to kind of dispel the notion that the black music scene, after the Coliseum was built, just died overnight. That, and people here on the panel are definitely indicating that didn't happen. I think it went on for at least 20 to 25 years after the Coliseum into the mid-'80s. This gentleman here mentioned Fred's Place. That was at 2511 Northeast Union. The upstairs lounge was at 2629 Northeast Union. Pink Pelican Records, 3820 Northeast Union. Bop City Records, 5130 Northeast Union. Lowell's Lounge, also known as Lowell's Silk Hat, was at 5144 Northeast Union.
I think it's the
That's
microphone.
Northeast
Would you
Union.
hand him that microphone?
It'll turn me up a little bit. Can't. Sorry. Oh, I'll just run through this real quick again. Fred's Place was at 2511 Northeast Union. Upstairs Lounge, 2629 Northeast Union. That later became the Friends of Distinction Social Club. Pink Pelican Records, 3820 Northeast Union. Bop City Records, 5130 Union. Lowell's Lounge, also known as Lowell's Silk Hat, 5144 Northeast Union. I saw a great local blues artist there named Raydell Clay, who was tremendous. And Milton and Oscars at 5700 Northeast Union. I saw some of the Willie Dixon band in there, minus Willie Dixon, but it was still a great band. they were passing through town. They kind of did a side gig. Then in North Williams, of course, Geneva's at 4228 North Williams, and the House of Sound Records, 3606 and 3634 North Williams. Then Alberta, the Royal Esquire Club was where the Inner City Blues Festival got started, and later became the Texas 2, but I'm unable to determine when the changeover happened, but it was 1708 Alberta. And then Shag's Arena at 1470 to 1488 Northeast Killingsworth later became DJ's Dance Machine Social Club. I remember going to see, I saw Albert Collins in Delta Park at a big kind of rock and blues festival, and he says, I'm going to sit in at Shag's Arena right after I get off, finish my set. So I just made a beeline for Shag's Arena and saw him playing there. It was really incredible. And I'm going to do my own handwriting here. Let's see. And there was also a club called Bourbon Street, where the McDonald's is on Weidler and MLK, 1520 Northeast MLK. And I caught that address as I was riding the bus by it. So just tonight, Now, Fred's place, we saw Johnny Guitar Watson in there when he was kind of in between his his early blues period, and then his kind of funk period that kind of came later, where he became kind of a big star. Really, really personable performer, really great guy. And then at the upstairs lounge,
Billy Larkin.
we saw Bobby Bland there in 1975, one of the greatest stars in R&B and blues. And then at the great Geneva's, we saw Jimmy Smith, Groove Holmes, and Houston Person and Etta Jones, among a lot of great local people with jams and different things. So we've got one more thing here. Fred's place, yeah. Okay.
He's got it.
Got it. But so there was a lot going on in Northeast Portland. I had a friend who, or still, I should say, still have a friend who, his family had a church over 15th and Jarrett, or 14th and Jarrett area. And he was very involved in the folk music scene here, and blues and R&B, and he'd take me around to all these places, and it really taught me a lot about the history of the music in Portland.
Why don't you tell us your name?
My name's Tom Wendt.
Wendt?
I'm
Spell
wearing a
that,
KBOO
Wendt?
t-shirt, and I'm kind of involved with KBOO, doing the blues
Kind of
show
involved
there.
with Cable.
Yeah.
And their great jazz history was.
So, the way music works, just because something or history, like the Coliseum is built, or 1960, everything just stops because it's 1960. Things went on for a number of years after this classic old neighborhood was demolished. Also, one thing I didn't see once, also I should say that at the Royal Esquire Club, or Texas 2, I can't remember when this happened, we saw another great organist, Jimmy McGriff, played in there. And, God, what was I going to say? I guess the Royal Esquire.
All right, well, let's
Anyway,
give him a big hand
wait.
because he's contributed vitally.
Hey, thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks Cable Radio. We remember George Page, the Master Blaster, who made sure that there was a lot of jazz music that was alive and kept alive on the air, and Cable Radio continues to be a great community radio station that contributes.
Tell Bob Little hello for me.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Let's put our hands together again. Thank Tom Lynch. Did any of those remarks, those names stimulate? I'm thinking about now as we begin to wind down, any favorite moments that you might recall in one of the clubs or one of the performances of some of the artists that he's mentioned? Anything come to mind?
One more question.
We got another question. Please.
But there's two places I want to make sure people
Porter's Club.
That's true.
Go a lot of places, but they could relax in the Porter's Club. You know, had about 100 steps going up there. I remember, because my dad took me up there once. But he was in there. But the other place is the Elks Club. It's now the Elks Club, but it was.
The Elks Club.
It's on Tillamook and Williams Avenue.
Right.
It's on the historic register. It started out as a USO club for blacks. And then it's now.
In 1926, it was the colored YWCA, and it is located on the corner. It's now the Billy Webb Elks Lodge at 6 North Tillamook, or the corner of Tillamook.
Historic
and Williams.
register.
Yes, and it's on the historic register. When they got into the later years, they were entering the years where I started going to nightclubs at the upstairs lounge and seeing Billy Larkin and any number of other musicians. Thera Memory, and you should know about Thera Memory's American Jazz program, American music program. His band of young people is competing right now for the Ellington competition in New York City. So that tradition is continuing, and it was Thera John Memory, composer and trumpet player, who introduced me to Walter Bridges and Walter Bridges Big Band at the Royal Esquire, which became the Texas 2 Lounge. Ben, you were going to say something?
Yeah, the clubs that this gentleman just talked about, this is post 1950, 50s and the 60s, because many of these clubs that he mentioned were white establishments that became jazz establishments over time. But our parameters initially were just through the 50s and early 60s, but music is alive and well in Portland. Got some of the greatest artists in the world live here. They choose to live here because they raise their families. It's such a great place to live. But a lot of the, I wanted to tell you about the pool hall because that's where bebop, the notion of bebop started with Ed Slaughter. Yeah, this is where these people came in and began to listen to this music because he was the only person in town that had the records. And when people came to town, they knew Ed was a jazz devotee, great collection. And the musicians were either playing music, listening to music, or talking about music. So all these great musicians that came to town would stop and talk to Ed Slaughter. And that's where Jim and I and a number of us got a chance to meet them. And I mean, it's Oscar Peterson, the top artists in the country, George Shearing. A lot of these people appeared uptown in McMenamins. Believe it or not, there was that much capacity to produce those kind of shows, and because they were very expensive. But that was in the, in that little nexus of the jazz clubs there at Williams and Wheeler Court. But again, the music moved north, up Williams Avenue as things changed. But it's
rich.
It's rich. It's always been rich.
Another Etta James story. Ronnie Steen, like I told you, he's 17 years old. He never played a show, so I was the MC at the club and introduced Etta. The band started playing. Ronnie Steen playing with Etta James. And if you saw the movie Cadillac Records, you know how she could be. Ronnie's just playing. She says, "Stop the music." She says, "You little so-and-so, you better give me a backbeat." And I mean now, and here's this little 17-year-old, his first show he ever played. I said, "Ronnie, you give her a backbeat?" He's been giving backbeats ever since.
I had the privilege of meeting Ben Johnson, and he said, they called me Youngblood. I was first started working on the railroad, and Judy Torrance McAfee, her dad was one of the people who was responsible for all the young bloods getting on the railroad. And of course, there are some panels in the back corner of the room that highlight the Golden West Hotel and the life of the color line, as they pointed out, and Oregon's history as it relates to that. But a lot of the musicians, and as you were talking about Ben Johnson earlier, he interfaced with the railroad men. And of course, they were dealing with the real estate and the economic side of life. And he said, "Youngblood, where's my cigar?" I said, "Your cigar, sir? Oh, you didn't know that I was cigar smoking Johnson." I said, "No, sir." He said, "Next time you see me, you better have my cigar." Well, I was terrified. I had heard of the reputation of him. I know that he was a big wig. So I had cigars, and I never received. And then when I did run into him, I said, "Cigar smoking Johnson, I got your cigar." He said, "Well, you just hold on to that cigar, young man. He said, but I tell you what, it's Mr. Cigar Smoking Johnson. I learned about the environment. And all our families, as we were kids and were growing up, our parents frequented the places that we are talking about here. And of course, I'm putting myself off as if I'm just a real youngster, but it was a very lively lively nightlife, and very respectful. There was very little conflict, and you might talk about the police presence. Both the county sheriff, which my dad was one of the auxiliaries that you mentioned, but also the interaction between the community and the police at that time, particularly as it related to nightlife in the Williams Avenue area and then later.
What happened, at least what allegedly happened, was you couldn't do all those things in that area without some kind of approval from over town. And Tom Johnson was known as the fixer. In other words, there was a bag man that came from over town that he fixed and allowed all those things to happen. But the police, you seldom, it was really community policing because they knew everybody. And everybody knew them. And another thing that happened too, there were no gangs and very few guns. Our whole concept about guns in those days was very, very different. And there were no drive-by shootings. It was a safe community because Tom made sure that it was safe because that's where the business was. But it was interesting, the interactions between those.
You have a question?
Hey, hi, thanks. My name is Carlos, and I don't intend to derail too much on what's being talked about, but I have a strange request. I kind of want to ask the advice of the panel, if that's okay.
Please.
Okay, so I've been in Portland about a year and a half now. I'm 7 months sober, and I'm realizing that Portland doesn't really have, for many, if any at all, doesn't have many havens for sober people or for black people. I want to open a dry bar and have it be a haven for both. I came in a little late, but I don't know if there was any discussion on sort of any history with dry bars or any such non-alcoholic or even under 18 spaces that were available for blacks in that time.
Yeah, there was. There were a couple. One was at the St. Philip's Church. It was sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese. They had a worker, Mrs. Bogle, Dick Bogle's mother, worked there full time. And that's where young people could go, and that's where we went. There weren't many places we could go. Some of the churches had youth groups, but most of them went to St. Philip's. And they even, in fact, they even came from Vancouver, Washington. McLaughlin Heights, Bagley Downs. Those were the housing projects during the war.
Well, thank you. Go ahead.
And the YMCA, the Elks Club now, like the lady over here spoke, that's where it was the Young Women's Christian Association, I think that's what it means. And that's where they would go and have all the teenage parties.
That came later. It became Gladys McCoy. Remember Gladys McCoy? She was the first director of that Y for young people.
Would you say your name again, sir?
Carlos Metcalf.
Okay, Carlos, Mr. Metcalf. When we're all done today, I'd appreciate if you came up, gave us your name and address. I think there's a business side of that, that while we've been talking about the nightlife, and the nightlife involved drinks and so forth, the business side of it, there's much for you to gain from the people who are here, and I'm sure that they would contribute to your idea pool.
That's what I'm looking for.
There you go. You're in the right place. Thank you for being courageous enough to mention your priorities. There's one question here and there's one over here. First here and then, I'm sorry.
I know this is putting you guys on the spot, but I was wondering if there was some kind of chorus or refrain from a song that you particularly love that just brings you back to that time that you might be courageous enough to sing a little time.
Oh yeah, Jim T been wanting to sing My Funny Valentine for a long time.
Yeah, I got rhythm, but I can't sing.
Please, your question? Thank you for your question.
When did the change start when blacks could get out of the regular community and start going to the other clubs? Is that like in the late 50s, early 60s when we were no longer confined just to our neighborhoods, and that here in Portland, I mean, I'm a graduate of U of O. Dr. Ed Coleman down there is a bassist who played with Tito Fuente. And
I'm a professor at the University of Oregon.
Okay. And one of the things that he was saying that for a long time, artists used to totally bypass Portland, but from what you're saying now, there was like a large influx. So when was there an actual change of attitude where people started both crossing the racial lines and when?
Civil rights legislation in 1964.
Okay.
That's when it really started. It was de facto segregation here. There was no laws that said they had to, but they did. The civil rights legislation then made it illegal to not treat everybody equal. But that's when you start breaking out in other parts of the community. You could go any place, people did. But until then, there were just certain places you could go. And you knew those places.
This was about 1967. A good client of ours at the Cotton Club, she bought a house on 21st and Thompson, and they burned a cross on her front lawn. She came in, she was, really upset. Paul, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? I said, well, you can report it to the police, but I don't think anything will be done about it. But he asked earlier about the policeman. Now, I have a nightclub, and I'm running it as best that I know how, clean, no drugs, no nothing going on. But these two police officers came in. It's the first time I've told this story because you can get in trouble if you tell stories on police officers, but don't have to call any names. They came in and said, well, Paul, you're going to have to pay us off in order to run this place. I said, what do you mean? Well, you're going to have to give us some money each week, otherwise we're going to get you closed down. And I didn't know what to do, so I called back in Spokane, a friend of mine up there. Not a friend, but I knew him, and he was a judge. And so I told him what was happening, so he called down here. And then I didn't see those officers anymore. It was about 20 years later when the officer said, Paul, did you have anything about getting us transferred out of that district? I says, no, I thought you guys just went on and asked for a transfer, But that actually happened to me. But I know if I'd have went to the police then, I probably would have been out of business. That's just the way the code is,
You could have gone to Tom Johnson.
Well, Mr. Johnson was gone by then, but at the same time, I'm going to ask Michael, too, before you guys leave tonight, I'm going to ask Michael to let me dismiss you as I would dismiss you at the Cotton Club. So, Michael, I'd like to have that opportunity.
All right, we're going to have that opportunity very shortly. We're going to take one more question. Over here. One question, please. And we have one. Who else has a question? Please raise your hand. Okay, good.
Okay, so the gentleman.
My name is?
Oh, my name is Richard Bassey. And the gentleman in the centre, one of the names he mentioned was Sidney Porter, and I don't think it's been mentioned. I have an album, an LP of Sidney Porter's, and on the liner notes on the back it mentions that he had a club on Northeast Sandy, and that Louis Armstrong used to go in there amongst others because he knew he wouldn't get hassled, and used to sit in with Sidney Porter, who played piano. So I don't think that could have been mentioned, if I didn't miss it. Any Louis Armstrong stories along the way, by the way?
I see different things to hear you. Said Louis Armstrong stories?
Yeah.
No, he played frequently at Jansen Beach, even when blacks couldn't go there. But he had a lot of black friends in town that he lived with. But he did come back and play in some of the clubs here. And in the early days, before even Williams Avenue, before the war, he played in Portland in some of the black establishments.
This isn't a music story, but one of the places he stayed in Portland was, I can't remember Morgan's last name, but Charlie, I think. Okay. He gave Morgan trumpet for staying there, so it had a red lining. But the point is, he had a special grease he put on his face. On his lip, it was made with goose grease and honey, and that he'd anoint his face each day before he played. That's probably not very much information.
One last question. Mr. West?
Hi, Tyler West, Senior. Very taught the history of Oregon and Portland nightlife. I definitely know each one of you gentlemen personally or by sight. Stuff my family's well known here, grew up here, and so forth. And I hear the stories from the war era to 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth, and frequent a lot of the clubs that you guys talk about. My question, more importantly, is, you know, as a young African American male myself, and been in business as far as entrepreneurship within music, club promoting, and so forth. It's unfortunate that we talking about a history that's pretty much no longer. I mean, yes, we do have Clyde, you know, which is black owned. We have Billy Way of Elks, which is owned by an organization, black owned. But that's only a small vapor as far as what we used to have. Paul owned several clubs, you know. At one time, Williams Avenue was filled with clubs. Union Avenue was filled with clubs. Alberta. And I caught the later, as a young teen, I caught the later of just being able to walk by and keep my head in, not being able to actually frequent. But now, as being a grown young man, I yearn for those places to go. Yes, we can go to certain other places. Yes, we can go anywhere in the city. But when you see that, when me trying to establish something for a black clientele or a clientele, usually the owners, people I have to deal with are someone who doesn't look like me. And that's an unfortunate piece. If Paul, if you still had your club or business at that time, I know that we could have been doing business and it would have been very successful as well. And I do know that a lot has dropped off as far as entertainers, as far as coming here through Portland, because they come here, they don't think it won't be actually supported by African American or by the audience here. There's not an audience here, so it'll go from California to Seattle. And, you know, also on the flip side, it's unfortunate, like I said, I don't understand why some of those places have disappeared. They're no longer there. It was before gentrification, truthfully, because like I said, as a young boy, I've seen them disappear. I've seen them get, you know, just one by one. Fred's place, I knew where Fred's place was. I knew where Geneva's was. And, you know, and it sat empty. Those lots stayed empty for years. Now they're building condominiums on it. So the thing is like, my uncle on my father's side was a founder of the Royal Esquire in Seattle. And it still is establishment and it still runs today. And that was established back in the 30s or 40s and so forth as well. So how come we don't have those same places that you're talking about, or some of them same places, still in existence?
What would you contribute to the demise? Bill, would you take that first?
Portland, Black Portland is going to go anywhere. They don't support anything.
Please?
It said Black Portlanders don't go anywhere. They don't support this kinds of entertainment thing.
But at one time they did.
At one time
But why did it change?
Well, there's a number, just a matter of numbers.
We all got old.
But you all have family. You all have.
Yeah, but we still today we still are 1%, a little over 1% of the state's population. In Portland, the metropolitan area is about 6%. So for every 6 white people, every 100 white people, you see 6 black people. There just aren't many to economically drive something by itself. You have to have, you know, other things going, or you got to have a special niche where you're in it by yourself. But you know, in terms of, I think Paul can best answer what happened to the clubs. But one thing happened with the Interstate 5 that wiped out Wheeler, Jerry Court, and all those places. Then there was but before that there was the Coliseum. So everybody moved north, and those clubs were vital for a while. But then the population modified, and you know, it just wasn't the population supported.
Things have changed.
They have
I think
changed.
that's one of the things. Portland is a unique city. It's beautiful, it's clean, but it's also considered Portlandia. And it's a little bit different from some of the other cities, and it's pure economics the reason that you have big bands or big names that start in Los Angeles, go to San Francisco, and go to Seattle, and come over to Portland. It just isn't the kind of market that justifies their agents, and there's a lot more people to pay than there used to be in the entourage and in the mechanics of setting up and running a show and renting the venues. And so I think it's just pure economics on the one side. And then for a long time, a lot of people, not one of the reasons that the population of Oregon is so small, the black population of Oregon is small, is because it was known that folks just weren't welcomed here. And they knew that because of the railroad men who had come here many, many years before, who had traveled from all parts of the country and experienced it and took that message back to Kansas City and back to Omaha and back to Chicago and back to Los Angeles. So as people migrated away from the South and away from the Midwest, they found that Oregon, and particularly Portland, wasn't as welcoming, even though it's a beautiful place now, and many people are coming here, and we have few problems, no matter how they want to describe it. So we have a history here. It isn't all as beautiful as we would like it to be, but it's real and it's rich. And what we've heard tonight is a testimony of authentic voices who were here, who, when we were confined to a smaller area and concentrated, so that a band that came here, or artists and musicians who did come here, could find it profitable, because they would get virtually everybody's money, including the people who came from across town. Jim T, you've got the microphone.
Yeah. Has anybody ever heard of this program called Partners in Diversity? Okay, they started in Portland several years ago. The first time they had a meeting, it was only about 75 people there. A month or so ago down at Homsey, they had over 500 people. And what this is, they are welcoming people of color who are coming into Portland for jobs. I mean, not coming for jobs, but these companies in Portland are recruiting and bringing in people of color. Down at Homsey, this last time they introduced, 35 people who have come into Portland, brought into Portland by different things like Kaiser, different law firms, and so forth. And I was talking with a friend of mine, and he said, I remember at one time there was only one black attorney in the city of Portland. He said right now there is 135 black attorneys in the Oregon bar. Not all of them are very few of them are in private practice. Most of them are in, the big law firms or the companies like Nike and so forth. But every 3 months they have this Partners in Diversity. They call it also Say Hey.
Say Hey.
And if you ever if you hear about it, or let somebody know, and they can send you an email or something, and so you can just go and see for yourself how the things are changing in the city of Portland. And like I said, every 3 months there's always anywhere between 30 to 35 new people that are coming into Portland, people of color that are coming into Portland, bring by the different companies and things like that. So you ought to check it out if you get a chance.
We give Vicky Nakashima a lot of credit for starting the Say Hey movement, which is now Partners in Diversity. They've sort of taken over the management of it, but it does welcome people of color who come here. And as Paul Noah pointed out, there's 135 African-American lawyers in Oregon State Bar. Most of them are females. So they have, it's not all men. They break in that tradition of men being the only lawyers.
One thing I didn't tell you when I was setting the stage for how it was back in the day, we had no lawyers, we had no policemen, we had no firemen, we had no teachers, we had no clerks, we had no longshoremen, we had no truck drivers, we had no bus drivers. Those jobs weren't available for blacks in those days. And you can see the reason I kind of said that to you, because what we're talking about, Mr. Grice has said today, things have changed. It's a different place today. And a lot of folks can't relate to how that was compared to where we are, and still have much work to do. This diversity program is one of those jobs.
As is race talks. How many people have been to Say Hey? Raise your hand. How many people have been here before to race talks? Okay, good. Well, you see the effort by even a small number of people is making a great difference. And, before I ask Paul Knowles to dismiss us, I would like to remind us that the Oregon Black Pioneers is doing a great job in partnership with the Oregon Historical Society. And Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that we are all woven together in a single garment of destiny. And we either learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools. Let's put our hands together and thank Jim Thompson. Mr. Ben Johnson, cigar smoking Johnson's brother. Mr. Bill Rutherford. There's an intellect. There it is. It shines through, Bill. I'm with Michael Chappie Grace. If you want to say goodbye, please, before we dismiss formally with Mr. Paul Knowles, I'll ask Madam Willie Richardson, and let's put our hands together and thank her too, with the Oregon Black Pioneers, for putting this thing together.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone.
Good evening.
I'm going to try that again. I'm a gal out of the South, and when I speak, I'm genuine about it. And if you don't respond, we're going to be here for a long time. Good evening. Good evening. Well, thank you very much. I won't take up much more time. It's been an absolutely fabulous evening. I've enjoyed every minute of listening to our fine group of young men here this evening. I want to thank them very, very much for their time, and thank everyone who's come out and who are worked on all of this. And before we have Mr. Paul Knowles, the man who cut my husband's hair when we first arrived in Oregon in 1978, with a 2-year-old son who was just absolutely adorable, cut his hair until he went off and served 20 years in the United States Air Force. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. This evening we have for each one of our guests here a framed copy of the poster for a community on the move. We also have a certificate for each one of you to place on your wall, on your desk, or if you choose to, in your drawer at home. I will not know about it such that I will be hurt because you didn't do visible stuff with it. So, as we are doing this and getting those handed out to each one of our guests, I'm going to put it back in the hands of Mr. Grice, who would then allow Mr. Knowles to dismiss us. And I am really anxious about what he's going to say to get us out the door. You know, when you don't have control over stuff, you don't know what folks are going to do. So, be kind and gentle, Mr. Knowles. Thank you.
You'll be on what they call on his best behavior. Let's put our hands together and thank the Oregon Black Pioneers, Willie Richardson and Kim Moreland. Kim, what's the name of your book? I'm asking Kim Moreland, author and historian, to introduce her own book that you might get your hands on it and become informed about this great history that we've just touched on tonight. Kim? What's the name of your book?
Thank you. It's called Images of America, the History of African Americans in Portland. And I really would encourage you to also come to our community dialogue on April 22nd at Portland State Native American Center. It's going to be called an Academic Perspective of Displacement. So we have several professors from Portland State University talking about displacement in Portland. I hope you can come.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you again, Oregon Black Pioneers. I'm Michael Chappie Grice. I'm with World Arts Foundation Incorporated. We just completed 30 years of the Keep Alive the Dream tribute to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It wouldn't be fair if I didn't mention Ken Berry and the great work he's done in partnership with the Oregon Black Pioneers and World Arts Foundation too. Paul Knowles, if you're ready, and do we need to hold your certificate for you? Can you do this with one hand? Again, put your hands together and thank Paul Knowles. Paul Knowles.
I would release you tonight from the auditorium. I'm going to do it like I used to do it at the Cotton Club. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the show tonight. You're on at the Cotton Club on 2125 North Vancouver Avenue. It's the only club on the West Coast with wall-to-wall soul. Now, you don't have to go home, but you got to get out of here.
Thank you very much, Paul Law. Thank you all, gentlemen. Jim T., Ben Johnson, Bill Rutherford, Eliza Candy Jones, the Oregon Historical Society, Oregon Black Pioneers. Thank you all very much. Come again to Race Talks, and thank you very much. Drive safely. God bless you.